Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to hearing number 10 for the review of the Selwyn District Plan. This morning we're dealing with ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity. Just before I hear from our first submitter this morning, anything for us from the reporting team?
Just a point of clarification, sir, that might be of assistance to the submitters. The phrase material infected by unwanted organisms is proposed to be introduced through hearing 6. Meaning material infected by unwanted organisms as declared by the MPI Chief Technical Officer or an emergency declared by the Minister under the Biosecurity Act 1993.
All right, thank you very much for that. The first submitter this morning is the Upper Waimakariri Rakai group, so come on up. So good morning and welcome, and just to everyone, I should have asked for the health and safety briefing. Grace, who's going to do the health and safety briefing this morning for us from the start?
And then there's bathrooms just out the door, down to your right, and then also down to your left, down that hallway.
Thank you. And I think the current mask protocol is when you're speaking, you don't need to wear it, but if you're just sitting in the room or moving around the building, then you wear a mask. Is that the current protocol still? Okay, thank you. So good morning and welcome again to yourselves and all the other submitters. Thank you very much for providing the written material that you have, your original submissions. And if you've provided any evidence in advance, thank you for that. We've read that, so you don't need to reread that out to us. You're obviously very welcome, though, if highlighting key points for our benefit. And if there's additional written information that you wish to table today, then we'll receive that and probably just have you read it out loud to us. But you don't need to read out loud anything that we've already received and read. But other than that, over to you if you want to introduce yourselves to us and then proceed to make your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Morena, good morning. We are the Upper Waimakariri Rakai group, and Rosalie Snoyink, I'm Susan Hall, and Kevin Dunn. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Is this working all right? Seems echoey.
Yeah, I think it's maybe just pull it a little bit closer to yourself. Yeah, if the red light's on, it means it's working.
It's working?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. There are 2 areas I wish to cover briefly today. Looking at Objective 921 from the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement is to halt the decline of ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity. And we are reminded daily of the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis, both of which are huge threats to our world. Our voluntary community group has focused our passion and our efforts on the protection of the high country, both the landscapes, the environment, and the biodiversity. I personally am greatly enriched by time spent in these special places, paying attention to the plants, the insects, and the birds in all their diversity. Summer is the time of tiny alpine flowers, hopping grasshoppers, rock wren bobbing amongst the rocks, and kea calling as they soar high above the mountains. Winter is the sunlight glistening on the snow, hanging icicles and snow heave. bellbirds singing regardless of the temperature. All the things we love and enjoy. Biodiversity loss must be halted and must have priority in the new district plan, with robust definitions and rules and consequences if the rules are broken. And that has been the focus of our written submission. I'd just like to spend some time talking about Objective 922, which is the restoration and enhancement of ecosystems and biodiversity, which can be achieved at scale in the high country with adequate funding and encouragement to allow natural regeneration. This must be coupled with weed and pest control. However, on the Canterbury Plains, where we all live, only tiny fragments, less than 1% of the original indigenous vegetation survives. And I'd just like to spend a little bit of time talking about our experience attempting to revegetate our 3 hectares in Kirwi. With the help of Te Ara Kakariki, whose vision is to plant green dots and corridors for biodiversity to thrive in, ki uta ki tai, from the mountains to the sea. This is a centuries-long vision. We have already planted 12,000 trees on our property. We're continuing to plant at a considerable cost, which we have estimated at current prices is $6 per eco-sourced tree. Ongoing weed and pest control is required. The pests we have to deal with, which would be everywhere on the plains, magpies, rabbits, hares, hedgehogs, rats, stoats, and possums, all of which we either shoot or trap. Plant pests include the scale insect, which over 2 summers killed more than 300 of our 3-year-old kanuka trees. Luckily, they're not a continuing problem. They seem to have achieved some sort of coexistence, but with climate change, who knows what's in the future? And these plant threats are going to only get more diverse, one suspects, with pests. Then there are the summer droughts, which mean hand watering trees, small trees with a bucket of water. Luckily, not every year. It takes a considerable amount of time to water hundreds of plants. Fire is a great risk also. We're hoping one day soon bellbirds will discover our bush and join the growing number of fantails and grey warblers that we already have. Projects like this have sprung up all over the plains with huge efforts from Te Ara Kakariki, landowners, volunteers and school children. Corporate volunteer planting days are great, and Bofamiskal came one year to our plant out. They funded all our trees for that year, and 30 staff planted over 1,000 trees in one day, which was a huge effort. That would have taken us 6 weeks to plant 1,000 trees. While these are all fantastic projects to educate school children, build community cohesion, sequester carbon, and increase biodiversity, how much better it would be if in parallel we could also halt the biodiversity loss in the high country. Benefits there would be seen in decades, not centuries. Lastly, I ask the Council to please consider some kind of moratorium on land use change while this plan is being finalised to prevent the gold rush of land use change we have seen in the Mackenzie. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I have it now. Thank you. I'd like to discuss briefly a couple of points, part of which Susan has touched on. But firstly, I'd like to talk about the plan, not so much the plan itself, but the implementation of the plan. There is a historical lack of monitoring and enforcement by council on issues of biodiversity loss and particularly removal of native vegetation. Issues seem to be only picked up through complaints, the complaints process, or through resource consent applications. But as has been noted elsewhere, much habitat clearance is done without resource consents. Complaints are often are made seem to go nowhere, and certainly in our personal experience. And you'll notice one of the photographs, I'm not sure it's in our submission or somewhere else, the Cass Flats, for example, where there's been a transformation of low bush, matagari, and other low shrubs into green pasture. We noted it, we reported it, we heard nothing back. We followed up, we heard nothing back. I accept the rules are insufficient at the moment, but the lack of feedback was really not very good. The whole area of monitoring and enforcement is so important, but seems to be under-resourced and without focus. The lack of monitoring and enforcement is really a major issue which could undermine the best of plans and lead to a continued loss of biodiversity. And that, to me, is a real concern. To achieve some sense of balance here, I suggest that the plan should contain specific mention of the Council's responsibilities to provide adequate resources and effectively monitor and enforce the rules around habitat clearance. The second point, perhaps on a slightly more positive note, I go into the high country frequently to restore my soul and recharge my energies. Time there allows focus on many of the things that Susan talked about, the colours, the textures, the scents, the solitude and the lack of human sound. The sounds of the rivers, the shape of the clouds, the range of flowers, plant growth, and tussock, particularly during spring and summer. Birdsong is another very special and uplifting feature of the high country, which brings me to the declining population of kea, and I'm sure we're all aware of that problem, and other threatened species. Now, in the plan, we see overlays, this is the draft plan, we see overlays for the protection of mudfish and crested grebe, but surely this protection, this level of protection needs to cover all our endemic and threatened species, not just 2 nominated species. And in particular, the kea. So briefly, just to illustrate this need for protection, and I'm talking here not at DOC level, not at national level, but rather at local level. And in particular at the Arthur's Pass Alpine Village and surrounds, where the vulnerability of these birds to the human interface is leading to their decline. Feeding of kea, which is strongly discouraged, still continues, and there's no way of stopping it. The birds become habituated, and this results in them hanging around the people, around the cars, and getting hit by cars. Lead on buildings, particularly on the roofs, is a second concern, and yet, despite all attempts in this area to even fund the removal of lead, there are certain individuals who refuse to do so. So the birds eat the lead, and then they get lead poisoning. And if they're lucky, they end up in a bird hospital and are rehabilitated. So this is an ongoing concern, but there seem to be no rules governing this, no rules protecting them. It's outside DOC's area of expertise and control. They have no rules to cover it. It's really a local thing. 12 kea have died in the village over the past 2 years, most through car strikes, and most of which were avoidable. Rules are needed. The Arthur's Pass Wildlife Trust and DOC are currently meeting to discuss the feeding of birds, the lead poisoning and the speeding of traffic. But we need the Selwyn District Council to step up and provide some sort of leadership here, some regulations at council level to provide a framework to protect these iconic species. This should have also include education and, if necessary, enforcement and fines. And this, just as a final note, is increasingly important as the effects of climate change put more and more pressure on our precious native fauna. And as a result of that, they're more and more likely to be seeking food from human sources. Thank you.
Thank you. So with the last 5 minutes, I'd like to just cover a few points. Thank you. Firstly, kia ora and good morning to the commissioners. I bring you greetings from the foothills, and I left my property early this morning. The sun just coming up. There was a bellbird singing loudly, and I'm not sure if it was the sun or that it knew I was on my way to this hearing, and to pass on their greetings too. I did spend some time over the weekend reading the submissions that were pre-circulated, and our group would endorse the submissions of the Canterbury Regional Council, Forest and Bird, Mr. Head's evidence, and for DOC, Mr. Mike Harding. We read through those submissions, and yes, we would like to support those. I'll just finish with a couple of, talking to a couple of photographs in our submission. And Grace, thank you if you would bring that up. We were hoping through our submission to emphasise our concern about the ongoing loss and how we halt it right from now because of this long process, and that we're still probably a year or two off before we get a decision. Now, we're lay people and we're not sure how the process works and whether the council or the hearing panel itself can bring some kind of halt to any further vegetation clearance. And as we said in the submission, evidence from others from reports that have been made seem to have analysed clearance up to about 2019, but it is ongoing, and I want to give you an example of that. This is just one of several examples in the high country. Oh, perhaps I need to stand, I could do it from here. But photo 10 shows greening, recent greening on Cotton's sheep range. And that photo was taken at the gateway into Lake Ida, to give you some area of the location. And that has occurred very recently. You can see the original vegetation. It was all like this, sort of grey shrubland. And there's a bigger piece of green out that side. And this photograph here is a satellite digital photograph of the fan. This is a fan off the Cotton range. And this is the same fan here. And this is really concerning and quite distressing to see, because I think that this is the way that it's gone about, that it's just a small bit starting, and then it's just next year is a bit more, and next year a bit more, until the whole fan has been turned green. And so this is this wonderful image of this fan. This is Lake Self here in Lake Evelyn, and this particular greening is in this corner, which hasn't shown up. This is a 2021 picture, so it shows you how recent that greening is. This is 2022. I can't tell exactly, but it's within the last 18 months. So it's this corner here, because here is the road into Lake Ida, and photo was taken about here. And you can see what's happening on this fan, although the green isn't showing up. Certainly the tracks are in the fencing, so that it begins with fencing the fan, and first with tracks and then fences, and then comes the fertilizer and the seed. So there's a big shingle river in the middle of this fan which divides it, but you can see how this is Lake Self, and this is a wonderfully scenic area. And so is the intention to green that end of Lake Self as well. That would be really worrying. And so I'll finish with one more photo. Thank you, Grace. And this is a magnificent photograph taken about a month ago of a fan in the Craigieburn area. This is the railway. And this is a fan which I suspect the clearance is beginning already, because you can see at the bottom there's simply no Matagari left. And then you start to get these lines, and that's a signal that some kind of change is happening. And so I'm wondering if in some time in the future I'm going to have to come back and have a before and after photo of that fan, which is magnificent. You can see the landscape effect from that. Is that about to be turned green as well? So it's just looking into the future, and I hope that that isn't the future for that fan. But, so on that, I'll leave, and thank you very much. And if we have any time for questions, well, that would be good.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I'll see if we have questions, and maybe if we pose our questions and just whichever one of you three feel best to answer, we can just do it like that if you like. So Malcolm, any questions?
Yes, I'm very interested in the suggestion that the Selwyn District Council should better provide a framework for protection of kia. I'm just wondering if you'd thought of any mechanism that a council might be able to use to do that we could put in a plan.
It's really outside of my area of expertise, but on the lead side of it, I would have thought that could come within the building code somehow. On the issue of feeding, I really don't know. Education is a key factor, but at the same time, what I was particularly talking about was a local person who has been educated, advised numerous times, and still refuses to feed and continues to feed the kia. Now, that sort of thing, you can only go so far with education on, but there are no mechanisms within which his behaviour can be dealt with. He's a local, he's well known. I personally don't know him, but I understand that he just seems to not wish to follow what's a reasonable thing to do.
Thank you for that. I am aware that there's moves from the heritage area for funding of removal of lead heads. So.
Lead heads.
From roofs.
Lead heads.
Are there any questions?
Welcome and thank you for your submission, and also for the mahi that you do in the high country. And yes, I totally relate to the morning. If I can share with you this morning, this morning when I pulled my blinds, I live at home on my whenua at my mauna. When I looked out at it this morning and I pulled the blind, the sun had come over and was just shining on the top. And it was amazing. It was like, thank you, because I'm able to start my day. That is the blessing for the day. So totally thank you for sharing. So I'm really interested in overlays and looking at that protection. And I see that you support the forest and bird overlay for a single fauna Indigenous overlay. Can you tell me what that might actually look like? Because that's suggesting something different outside of what is currently there. Have you thought about what that might look like?
Well, we've given thought about what we hoped it would achieve. And because it does seem interesting that the council has just chosen 2 species, the mudfish and the Australasian crested grebe, when there are all these threatened species which need equal protection. Would it not work just like an ONL that, and I imagine that Forest and Bird will talk more about this, I don't know, but we thought that was worth supporting because it was the only tangible thing that we saw as a solution to this, because it is, that was another, as lay people, another issue. There doesn't seem to be a list of the threatened fauna species. There are 3 or 4 ecologists giving evidence to this hearing that the terrestrial species there doesn't seem to be a list, and there may be a reason for that, I don't know. Maybe it's because you look after the habitat. If you look after the vegetation, you are protecting those species anyway. Is that the reason? I'm not sure. But how that overlay, we'll be listening into the Forest and Bird Submission to find out what they think about that too, how that will work, yes. But apart from that, we can't give you any more, I don't think.
I think we're talking here about on private and community land. Certainly, the Department of Conservation has the protections in place and the mechanisms for doing that on its land. It may be that some of the frameworks that they use could be borrowed across to the local council structure. Just a final thought.
So looking at the rules, looking at the provisions, you know, looking at the protection of habitat, and that very point that you were making, that in terms of if you look after the habitat, you look after the other species that are, you know, within and that habitat or that ecosystem that is there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you think that with the changes that have been recommended from the section 42 report, that has come a long way in terms of looking at that protection for habitat and Indigenous species?
Oh, it is a big improvement. Yes, that's for sure. I think that the definition around improved pasture, that is the one that is going to be all deciding whether species will be protected, for sure, because that is the one weakness in the plan. I think that definition that is in the proposed plan, and there are several groups calling for a change in that. Yeah, and if that happens, then we'll be very reassured that the council will be meeting its obligation. Yeah.
And also looking at some of those changes that have been recommended, like looking in the high country in terms of funding that Matagari in particular, the protection of the clearance. Have you got any view in terms of threshold and the time periods that have been suggested? You know, have you got any views around that at all within the rules that are there for the protection? So it's a permitted activity for clearance, yeah. But there are certain rules that have, you know, thresholds as to when you could actually, you know, clear how much and during time. And I know Matagari is one of your concerns. Have you got any thoughts around that?
Well, I think if you go back to that definition that is being asked for, that totally converted land, then you don't need a resource consent. Any activity on that land is permitted. But where there is Indigenous vegetation, then a resource consent is required. And then it will get fully assessed by ecologists or for landscape assessment if that is needed. That's the simplest and clearest way to do it for everybody, I think. Yeah. And mapped, those areas mapped, which I'm reading Mr. Harding's evidence is not too difficult an exercise by the sound of it. Yeah.
And just as a, excuse me, a point of reference, the photograph that's included in the submission of a Matagari bush, that particular bush could be somewhere in the order of 400 years old or more. They're very long-lived and very slow growing. And I think they're often maligned as being just a nuisance tree and get rid of them without people really understanding how long they take to grow.
And if I could just finish by saying everything is precious now because we've lost so much. And that was quite distressing fact to read in the evidence too, that the number of threatened species had increased from 191, I think it was 191 to 245. Now that was a shock. That really was a shock. So I think everything now is precious and needs proper assessment before any more removal of Indigenous vegetation occurs. Because are we just going to keep seeing that number rise otherwise?
Lindsay, any questions?
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Just a couple of points I'd like to clarify, if I may. In terms of the definition of Indigenous vegetation and the reference to non-vascular plants within this district, would that include mosses and lichens?
I just on reading the evidence, because we aren't experts in this area. Yes.
Okay. And you've raised the issue of the definition of improved pasture, which is an interesting issue. Of course, we have a definition within the National Policy Statement, Freshwater Management, which we have to give effect to those higher order instruments. That same definition was already included in the exposure draft of the MPS for Indigenous biodiversity, which has no legal weight, but nevertheless, that's been promulgated by government. So that's an issue we'll need to turn our minds to, whether or not. I think I agree with you, we do need a definition, but we need to reflect on the higher order documents that we must give effect to in that regard. You've mentioned mapping. We can only respond to submissions. And there was one submission that requested a particular area be mapped, and that's been recommended to us by the officers. If we were to include, we don't have scope to include any other mapping. That would need to be done by way of a variation or a plan change, so that all interested parties could have their say on those mapped areas. We can't do that.
We would certainly be supporting that.
Yes, and that may well happen in the future. And I think once the MPS Indigenous Biodiversity comes out, then council will be obliged to do that anyway over a period of time. I want to ask you about edge effects. The staff, I think, have recommended to us that that issue was covered by the definition of Indigenous vegetation clearance, and they've recommended to us including two further words in there. One is shading and one is invasion. Are there any other words that in your experience would define edge effects just from an on-the-ground perspective, apart from shading and invasion?
Well, edge effects go beyond just those two. There are a whole range of, and we've put that out in our submission, the effects from that, and that's been very well looked at in Mackenzie, and the research is ongoing. And what is a surprising fact of that is the distance that the edge effects occurs from the source. We all thought it was quite close, but now they're talking up to 300 meters. If you get a dusty day and the dust carries it from that area, well, that can go even further, I imagine. But again, you'll hear more from the ecologists on that, I would say.
Okay. Yeah. All right, and just in terms of some of the things you've asked us to do, our role is quite narrow. Our role is to recommend changes to the notified provisions in the plan in response to submissions. So we have no role in imposing or even suggesting a moratorium on vegetation clearance or the issuing of consents. Therefore, we also have no jurisdictional role to play in terms of council's monitoring, enforcement or funding. They're all long-term plan and annual planning matters that the council themselves are responsible for. Our role is quite limited. So I just didn't want you to go away with any false hopes that we can give effect to those things that you've put before us this morning. All right, but other than that, thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate the effort you've made.
Thank you. Thank you.
So our next submitter is Horticulture New Zealand, and I think we have Lynette Wharf coming in on Zoom. Yes. Yeah, good morning, Ms. Wharf. Can you hear us?
Yes, I'll just turn my other live stream off so I'm not listening to myself as well. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we certainly can, coming through loud and clear. So you've appeared before us many times before, but thank you very much for the information you've already provided. You don't need to reread that out to us, but you're very welcome to highlight key points, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Yes, this issue, as you can tell from my evidence, there's just a couple of really key points, and that is that horticulture crops can be managed and harvested within the context of the rules for Indigenous biodiversity or vegetation clearance, and also the issue about the unwanted organisms, which there's been reference to the decisions on hearing 6. Now, there was actually no hearing for hearing 6. It was all taken as tabled. And so I'm not quite sure if you're the same panel that were considering matters in hearing 6 or whether it was another panel. So it's just that there is an interface with hearing 6 that we need to make sure is covered off. I went looking on the website, but I couldn't find out who was actually considering hearing 6 matters.
Yeah, well, I wasn't. No. So that's, we can liaise on that with our colleagues and the council officers, but we just had it reported to us this morning that the staff have recommended definition for that, which relates to notification by government officials of particular organisms as a need arises.
Yeah, and that definition is pretty much as sought by Horticulture New Zealand, and we would be happy as long as there is some, because what the issue is that if there's a biosecurity incursion, it's not limited to exotic species. In fact, conservation estate can be threatened by an unwanted organism as much as horticultural crops. So we need to be able to ensure that if there is an incursion that needs to be addressed, that there is the ability to do that. And in some cases, a wilding type plant gets infected and it covers host plants, and which could be indigenous, and they all need to be removed as a part of getting rid of the unwanted organism. So we just need to make sure that there's scope for that. But happy to provide further information on that issue if needed by the Hearing 6 panel or yourself. The other, the section 42A goes some way to address the issue, such as the unwanted organisms, and also the inclusion of, our main focus is on the new Eco RC3 and the exclusions from that rule. So the inclusion of G for shelter belts is appreciated, but I've still got a query about the cultivation, and I noticed you had some questions about whether cultivation was necessary, and the response to question 1230 said that previous cultivation was to be removed. But if I look at Eco R3 RC3, we've still got cultivation in O and P. So I can't quite reconcile that with the response to the questions where it said that cultivation was going to be removed. And I just wanted to draw that to your attention, because not all horticultural crops are cultivated. Vines, trees, for instance, would not necessarily be cultivated. Vegetable crops, yes, but not vines and trees. The other thing Horticulture New Zealand has a concern about is policy P3 and the inclusion of small scale, low impact. And my hearing evidence focus more on the existing activities, and there's been no further question or response on that matter, but want to draw your attention that we're very concerned about the small scale, low impact wording in that policy. And the other matter I just want to clarify, in the revised strike through that attached to the questions, the definition of Indigenous biodiversity still includes the words includes all New Zealand's ecosystems. And I thought in response to question 2432, it was recommended that that be deleted. And I just want to make sure that that is should be crossed out in the recommended changes. But apart from that, quite happy to take questions.
All right, thank you very much for that. Malcolm, any questions?
No questions.
Are there any questions for Horticulture New Zealand? No. Lindsay?
Good morning, Ms. Wolf. You may you talked about policy P3 and the changes which have been recommended in the section 42A report, and then you give an alternative wording. Your alternative wording is outside of significant natural areas enable the continuation of existing activities to maintain Indigenous biodiversity. Isn't that very open in terms of existing activities? Because potentially some existing activities may have an adverse effect on Indigenous biodiversity. This is at policy level.
Potentially. And all I was thinking was, if we're talking about maintaining or enhancing, if the existing activities are maintaining or enhancing what is there, should that not be the situation that's retained? That was what was behind my thinking. Maybe the wording's not quite right. I acknowledge it could be better worded, but it was trying to say, hey, these is thinking from the primary production sector. They've been operating, they've maintained or enhanced this biodiversity outside of SNAs. How can we have a policy framework that allows that same status quo to continue?
Yeah, I understand that, but I think from my reading of your evidence, your main concern is around the term small scale or low impact activities. Isn't there some way in a policy that you can recognise that there are activities which are day-to-day, run-of-the-mill that can be carried out? Is there a happy medium in between the two?
Well, I think we need to be more specific than small scale, low impact, because how would a grower know, make a determination on that? That's equally as vague.
I accept that some may feel it's vague without some sort of definition, but equally, continuation of existing activities could be considered to be vague as well, couldn't it?
Well, if there are existing activities which are maintaining the existing Indigenous biodiversity, I would have thought that provides a bit of a benchmark. So, I acknowledge that the wording's not particularly clear, but the point, if we go back to the objective, is to maintain what's there. So it's about giving effect and flowing through in the wording and the policy to give effect to that objective.
Okay, thank you. My other question was in relation to your paragraph 717 about the 5-year limitation that's been applied to horticulture. Could you just fill me in, just give me a little bit more background about why a 5-year or 10-year or no limitation is a problem?
Well, I don't understand that. I haven't found any. Well, it's a problem because, as I said, not all horticultural systems cultivate. So if they haven't been cultivated, then they don't fit the bill, such as a blueberry crop, for instance, where the soil is not cultivated. Vegetable crops is. Just lost you. So it was trying to be equitable across all horticultural crops, that we wanted the exclusion of cultivation.
But you're not actually opposed to having some form of limitation, a 5-year limitation or a 10-year limitation?
Well, cultivation, where cultivation is undertaken.
Okay.
But the rotational system means that you aren't cultivating year on year, and it might take a number of years to get back around in your rotation. So if something's self-set in that time before you get back to your next rotation, you don't want to be limited.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
So just a follow up on that final point, that your evidence at your para 721, you're recommending to us the deletion of the words where cultivation has occurred within the past 5 years. So is that still what you're asking for?
Yes, because I wanted to apply to all horticultural systems.
Yep, and hence your suggestion of the word, adding in the word or planting, cropping or planting.
Yeah, or amending, is it O in Eco RC3.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what that paragraph refers to in your evidence. So,
Yeah.
all right, I just wanted to check that was still what you're asking for, but other than that, no further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Canterbury Regional Council. So to the CRC team, good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for the obvious hard work you put in terms of your submissions and the evidence and legal submissions you put before us. So very welcome for you. Oh, very happy for you just to present your case to us as you see fit. Maybe introduce yourselves and then just be aware that we have read the pre-circulated material, so you don't need to reread that to us, but you're very welcome to highlight key points. But other than that, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Commissioners. My name is Mike Duisberg, Counsel for Canterbury Regional Council. With me are the three witnesses who filed the evidence that you will have read, and just to orientate you to them, to my right is Dr. Grove, to his right is Ms. Irvine, and to my left is Mr. Cox. Yes, thank you. As you mentioned, Mr. Chair, we filed legal submissions and evidence, and we don't plan to read any of that to you. The witnesses may highlight a couple of points from their summary. But in a nutshell, the Regional Council's position is that ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity need to be protected. And that's not contentious. That flows right down from Section 6C of the RMA through various national planning documents, through the RPS and down into this plan ideally, or it must. It's a requirement in giving effect to those superior documents. The Regional Council's concern with the scheme of the plan as notified was that there was some quite heavy reliance placed on scheduled significant natural areas, scheduled SNAs, but unfortunately an accompanying empty schedule. And so the Regional Council submission sought to address that. And the obvious concern was that there would be loss of ecosystems, quality and quantity, or significant Indigenous biodiversity. In the meantime, Rome would be burning while we were waiting for the schedules to be filled. And Dr. Grove's evidence, you will have seen highlighted just 10 examples based on information the Regional Council has that indicated areas where there is unmapped biodiversity that could be lost. The happy news is that the Regional Council is very grateful for the work that's been done by Ms. Carruthers and the Council team, the District Council team, and the Regional Council supports the recommendations of the 42A reporting officer. The combination of the change to the definition of significant natural area and the restructuring and revisiting of the rules gives the Regional Council comfort that in areas where SNAs have not been identified yet, the rule framework will respond and essentially protect areas that meet the criteria for significance in the plan, which has flown down from the regional policy statement. And the short point is, although not every single submission point from the Regional Council has been accepted, it is content and endorses the changes recommended to you by the 42A reporting officer, Ms. Carruthers. Now, unless you have any legal questions for me, I'll hand over to Mr. Grove.
Maybe if we just hear from your whole team, and then we'll just put questions out there, and whoever is best to answer them can answer them, unless we have a particular witness in mind, which we'll direct you to. Otherwise, I think we'll hear your whole case and then take it from there, if that's okay.
Oh, of course. Thank you, sir.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks for the opportunity to present today. Yeah, I guess I'll just go quickly through my summary points and then pass on to my colleagues, and then we can come back for questions. So yeah, as we've just heard, the Canterbury Regional Council supports the amendments proposed to the definition of significant natural area. In my evidence, I've given some examples of why why that's the case. And I've also added a couple of other points in terms of the evidence of Dr. Lloyd provided on behalf of Selwyn District Council. I thought a lot of his evidence I agreed with. There's a couple of points of disagreement. I did not support the proposed definition of improved pasture that Dr. Lloyd did, and I did not support Dr. Lloyd's conclusion that braided rivers do not need to be scheduled in EIB Schedule 3. And I've explained that in my evidence. So, yep.
Kia ora, I'm Jolene. I don't think I have anything more to add than what's in my written evidence, just here for questions.
No, thank you. Your evidence is very concise, though. Thank you for that.
And Mr. Cox, he just has a few corrections to make to his brief. If you want to make a note of those.
Kia ora, Commissioners. So just jumping straight into the corrections I'd like to make. So paragraph 49, in the third sentence, it should read, the recommended amendment would mean that it would apply to all SNAs. So currently that word apply is missing. And just in paragraph 52, sorry. Just in paragraph 52, there's just two other corrections I'd like to make. Yep. So the sentence reads, I agree with the recommendation of the S42A author to reject the submission points raised by Beef and Lamb and Deer New Zealand, seeking to limit. So that last three words, seeking to limit, should be removed. Yeah. Yep. And finally, in the last sentence, it should read, Eco Schedule 1 reflects the criteria set out in the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement, and this must be given effect to in the proposed district plan. So the word effect is missing. Yeah. Great, thanks. Sure. Thank you. So that's all. I think Mr. Dosberg's summarised my submission quite well, so happy to jump straight to questions.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we'll see if we have questions. And panel members, if you have a general question, just pose it. If it's particular to either the legal submissions or a specific witness, just maybe highlight that. So welcome questions. No questions? Have you any questions?
Kia ora and thank you. I just want to acknowledge and thank you for a very good submissions, and also to that. No, I think I'll just leave it at that. Kia ora. Thank you.
Lindsay.
Yeah, just a couple if I can. It seems like from the ecological evidence that's been presented, there is a dispute about this definition of improved pasture, and there's also some concerns that areas of improved pasture should be mapped and used as the basis of a consent process if necessary going forward. Is there some sort of middle ground in between the two? Is there a collection of data that could be easily produced which would define where areas of improved pasture are? Because it seems to me that there is a little bit of uncertainty either way about what is improved pasture and what's not, and the definition is the nub of that. It's probably to you, Dr. Grover, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, the problem lies with the definition, first and foremost. That's why it is difficult to map, because the definition is not clear and it means different things to different people. Mm. My view is what is clear and has been touched on by the earlier submitters is something called what's been called another submission evidence is converted pasture. That's where the existing vegetation has been completely cleared and replaced by exotic grass or crops. That's very obvious on the ground. It's very easy to map. It's very easy to map from aerial imagery and then, just ground truth it if necessary. Yes. Where it becomes more complicated is when you have a definition of improved pasture, which actually includes a mix of native and introduced species. That becomes very difficult to map. But yeah, it's a difficult exercise, and it's a difficult exercise even deciding whether it's improved pasture or not, as it's currently defined. And also, I think the mapping aspect of it, it's temporarily variant. Like different times of the year, the nature of particularly those sort of mixed native exotic vegetation covers will change depending on the season. You know, it'll go from green to brown at different times of year, and also the relative abundance of grasses as opposed to, say, you know, the lower statured mosses, lichens, and herbs in the ground cover. So there's all these reasons why mapping improved pasture as it's defined in the proposed plan would be very challenging. And I also think improved pasture as it's defined in the plan, if stepping outside of defined SNAs, if an objective is to maintain Indigenous biodiversity by allowing continued clearance of vegetation that includes Indigenous biodiversity, it's obviously not delivering on that objective. So I think for clarity and simplicity, mapping of converted pasture would, and saying, okay, within those defined areas, permitted activities, no need to apply for resource consents or go through that sort of process, would be the simplest solution in terms of just giving clarity.
Okay. And leading on from that, I'm really interested in, from a practicality, workability, and enforceability perspective about the package of rules, where you have, for example, a plot of land which has some Indigenous ecosystems, biodiversity contained within it, but it's generally used for farming activities, you know, grazing, potential grazing in and amongst that. If there is a proposal to remove some, whether it be a very small amount or a greater amount depending on it, and it's subject to a resource consent application, what sort of information requirements are going to be required other than species definition to actually be able to, and this is probably a line of questions I'm going to ask the other ecologists as well, how practical and workable is it from an ecology perspective to actually gather that information? Is it an onerous exercise? Is it straightforward? Is there a number of publicly available documents and so forth available that can feed into that, or would there have to be site-specific ground truthing of each of them?
Unless there's existing information, and in many cases there is, then that can be drawn on, although it needs to be current, of course. So I think there would need to be, as part of a resource consent process, some sort of ground assessment, even if it's just verifying that existing information is still current. If there's no existing information, then obviously an ecological assessment would be required. I don't see that as particularly onerous. You're not going to get 100% intelligence on the species composition of an area of interest. I mean, there's things that Mr. Harding talks about in his evidence, like fungi, for instance, which none of us know much about at all. There's invertebrates, there's whole components of biodiversity which are very difficult to sort of document. But I think in terms of vegetation cover, larger species, birds, lizards, and the ecological effects of the proposed activity, which often generally clearance of some description on those, is relatively straightforward to assess.
And in terms of the consequences of it, it's going to depend on the scale of removal of Indigenous biodiversity. Where I'm thinking is guidance to a decision maker. You have an application. The ecological rules actually apply in those particular circumstances. What is a case where an application might be declined compared to something which might be acceptable?
Well, I guess if it's going through a resource consent process, then it becomes an application of the effects management hierarchy. So the case will be declined if the adverse effects are significant, and if they can't be avoided, remedied, mitigated, offset, or compensated for. And there's So that's where that's where the decision can be made, I suppose, is can those effects be managed and how can they be managed?
All right. Thank you for that.
Just a couple of points I'd like to ask you about, and Mr. Dosberg, firstly with you, this definition of improved pasture. In terms of context, it's currently only recommended to be used in one rule, Eco RC.3.I, which relates to the clearance of Indigenous vegetation outside of an SNA. So that's the context for the utility of that definition. It's also mentioned in the table of contents or the what's to be included in the biodiversity management plan. But in terms of rubber hitting the road, it's that rule that's important. But Mr. Dosberg, we have a definition of that in the MPS-FM. We must give effect to an MPS, so aren't we obliged to use that definition? Isn't that the start and end of it?
There's certainly a compelling argument to be made that you need to implement that definition. The difference is, and I classic legal answer, yes, but it depends.
Yeah.
The NPS-FM uses that definition in a particular way, and it tends to link through to the NES freshwater in relation to wetlands. And so it's those objectives, policies and rules that you need to give effect to as opposed to every single definition. But look, I think in terms of ensuring integrated and working planning documents, I think there would be a big problem, even if you're not strictly required to lawfully put that definition in order to give effect to the MPS-FM 2020. There would be a problem if we are working with different definitions of improved pasture across different documents. It just makes it very difficult for people. I'm sure you'll be aware and alive to this, but the government is consulting on changes that would remove that definition from the MPS-FM 2020. But unless and until that comes into force, that's give no legal regard to that. It's the live document you need to use.
Yeah, exactly. And I had noted that those are the recommended changes, but goodness knows when they'll see the light of day. That same definition was already also included in the exposure draft of the MPS Indigenous Biodiversity. That also carries no legal weight, but it does indicate government's thinking at the time. So yeah, there is some quite important pointers towards using that definition. Okay. The next question I have is in terms of Eco Schedule 3. Which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that schedule or if you can have it identify what it is, but it's a schedule that was in the notified plan which relates to Indigenous species and area lists. It's no longer referred to at all in the provisions, and DOC has recommended that that schedule be deleted accordingly because it serves no purpose. Does the Regional Council have a view on that particular schedule, whether it should be retained or kept? And if not, if you don't have a current view, I'm happy for you to go away and think about that and come back to us.
I think my view would be that the changes that are recommended by the S42A officer would capture those areas anyway. So I'd probably agree that it's all right not to be in there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cox. That's a very clear and helpful answer. They're the only questions I had, but I'd just like to express my thanks to Mr. Dosberg, to you and your team. Obviously, the view of the Regional Council is vitally important to us because we must also give effect to the RPS, and the RPS has some very comprehensive provisions on biodiversity. So we appreciate the assistance that you've given us. It's been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioners.
Good morning and welcome to the Transpower representatives. I think we've seen both of you before, so you know the drill. So over to you.
Good morning, Ainsley McLeod, planning consultant for Transpower, and I'm joined today by Trudy Birdie from Transpower. I think she's been here before as well. I hope we can be really brief today. My evidence, in the most part, agrees with the Section 42A report and just raises three issues that are mostly of a planning kind of ilk, and just they deal with the relationship between the energy and infrastructure chapter and the eco chapter. You've read my evidence. I have suggested that the relationship between important infrastructure and Indigenous biodiversity is dealt with in the energy and infrastructure chapter, and that the policy framework in the eco provisions perhaps would be best served by directly cross-referencing so that there's no conflict or differing directions in the way that important infrastructure is managed for any clearance of Indigenous vegetation. Similarly, I've raised an issue around the rules and how they work for maintaining, upgrading or new, in the case of my evidence, national grid transmission lines, and note that there's an enabling pathway for maintenance and operation. There's specific provisions for new transmission lines or transmission type infrastructure, all in the energy and infrastructure chapters, whereas upgrading takes you through a compliance pathway in the eco provisions, and that has this odd outcome of an upgrade likely being a non-complying activity, whereas a brand new transmission line would be a discretionary activity. This is the same issues came up for natural features and landscapes, and those that heard me give us very similar evidence there. I've just suggested a way in which you can work with the provisions in the energy and infrastructure chapter to not trigger a consent, but to trigger a consent more appropriately and allow an asset to be sweat rather than, you know, perhaps encouraging building new as a preferable consent pathway. The last matter I raise in my evidence is in relation to policies for offsetting, and it's a minor point, but just ensuring that the policy framework doesn't take users of the plan down a path of being compelled to offset, and I highlight the various higher order planning document reasons why I suggest that compulsion to offset is inappropriate.
Anything?
No.
No. All right, excellent. Thanks for that. We'll see if we have questions. Malcolm, any questions? No. Have there any questions for the Transpower representatives?
Kia ora, good morning. No, thank you. I'm fine. Thank
Thanks.
you very much.
And Lindsay.
Good morning. Just a couple of things. Your para 33 introduces a change to policy eco PB as we now know it. And I don't know whether you've been in the various hearings where there's been questions about the use of the word manage and what useful guidance that gives to decision makers. I think some of the questions have been that really could be all things to all people, that you manage a problem by something which is not defined. Did you have any comment in relation to that? Because you've introduced the words are managed in this particular policy as
Yes.
a preference.
I have no issue with using a different word there.
Yeah.
For instance, addressed. It's not intended to be a meaningless expression about how effects are dealt with, because when you go to EIP2, it has a quite clear step through approach about how effects are addressed, if you like, or managed. Yeah. So it's not intended to just be a catch-all, council use your judgment, whatever is kind of approach. It's EIP2 really does provide a framework for all a complete range of the effects management hierarchy.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
EIP2 will also direct you to the various different policies relating to ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity if necessary as well. Well, I wasn't on the EI hearings, but
Yes, it has quite explicit instruction about how the effects of important infrastructure are managed. It doesn't just say manage. Yeah.
so you're quite happy that the EI chapter and this chapter, the chapter we're looking at here, are properly and consistently cross-referenced, and there's no particular problems apart from
what
the one
I'm
you outlined.
suggesting is that currently there's avoid policies and then a policy that says how you consider effects of important infrastructure in the 42A version.
Yeah.
My suggestion is if you've got an avoid policy, there's no point even having this. And by the way, when you're dealing with effects, this is what you think about, because you're going to have to avoid. That is in conflict with what's in the energy and infrastructure chapter post hearing that does give an effects management direction for important infrastructure in areas of significant Indigenous biodiversity. So the solution I propose in my evidence is that the policy in the eco chapter says where it's important infrastructure, it's managed over here, not by these avoid policies up here.
Okay, well, that's understood. I did have, just again, a pretty minor point. Your changes to your paragraph 42, where you talk about Eco P8, where you've proposed the insertion of the words that are offered or agreed, and that's understood. But I'm just wondering, in terms of the very front end of that, you've turned it into now a negative policy by putting the words only consider.
Only consider the 42A words.
Yeah.
And reading this, it's not elegant at the moment, but I think that you get my point. That the point is, it's my opinion, offsetting shouldn't be compelled by the provisions. It should be an option that's available where offered or agreed.
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
but I think what you're saying is it looks a bit inelegant, and I would agree.
Yeah. No, I realised that it was from the 42A, so apologies for thinking that you inserted that. But I just wanted your view on the whole terminology, and normally policies are written in a positive accept framework as opposed to a negative but.
Yes, I have seen this expression used. The Dunedin District Plan uses it. Only allow quite often as well. It's probably not my preference, and that's probably why my solution isn't so helpful.
All right, thank you.
Just before I ask you a question, I want to ask the reporting officers a question. Eco P4, is that a plantation forestry specific provision? Is it intended to be specific to plantation forestry, or is it a general provision that applies to all activities?
That's intended to apply to all activities.
All activities. Okay, so now I can ask my question of you. Then my question of Transpare is, rather than include a whole new Eco PB as recommended to us, would it be simpler just to roll some words into Eco P4 that refer, that provide an exception for important infrastructure managed under E1 P2? So roll it into P4 rather than have a whole new policy?
Yes, that would work.
That would work?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And in terms of the issue that you raised at your paragraph 53 and the recommended wording there, so again, not a question for you because I understand the point you're making, but to our Ms. Carruthers, can you liaise with Mrs. Barker and just come back to us with a combined reporting officer view on the changes that are recommended at Ms. Ainsley paragraph 53, please? And that'll be done as part of the reply. But I certainly appreciate the issue being raised and the need to address it somehow. But other than that, no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
So I think our next submitter is the Environmental Defence Society, appearing on Zoom. Ms. Woodhouse, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me okay?
Certainly can. Thank you
Wonderful.
very much for appearing before us on Zoom this morning and for the legal submissions that you've lodged in the original submission. We've read that information. You don't need to reread that to us, but you are very welcome to highlight key points for us that you'd wish us to bear in mind, and we'll see if we have questions for you.
Great. Kia ora koutou. So as outlined in the written submissions, Aotearoa New Zealand's Indigenous biodiversity is in a perilous state. The picture in the Selwyn district is no different. The Selwyn district supports a range of Indigenous biodiversity, a number of which would meet the criteria for significance in the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement. Council's obligation in respect of Indigenous biodiversity is clear and directive. These directive provisions are set out in my legal submissions, but to reiterate, there are dual objectives of protection and maintenance. Councils have an express obligation to maintain Indigenous biodiversity under Section 31B(3) of the RMA. This is a core part of safeguarding the life supporting capacity of ecosystems, which is required under the sustainable management purpose of the Act. Section 6C builds on that obligation and requires that significant Indigenous biodiversity and habitats of significant fauna be protected as a matter of national importance. This is a stronger obligation and means to keep safe from harm, injury or damage. These obligations are reflected in the provisions of the RPS, which must be given effect to in the plan. In order to give effect to these obligations, EDS sought a number of changes to the Section 42A recommendations. These can be distilled into 5 key points: the definition for Indigenous vegetation, the definition for improved pasture, identification of significant natural areas, provision for unwanted organisms, and the new policy for important infrastructure. Turning to the first point, which is the definition for Indigenous vegetation. EDS is concerned that the definition of Indigenous vegetation fails to recognise non-vascular plants that may be an important part of many natural ecosystems. Dr. Lloyd for Council considered this to be a moot point on the basis that non-vascular plants are still plants and are therefore covered by the general term plant. However, the evidence of Mike Harding illustrates that this is not the case. Lichen and moss are both considered non-vascular plants. While mosses can be considered plants, lichens are not. Lichens are not strictly defined as plants, and they would therefore not be covered by the definition proposed. And I've just pulled up a definition of lichen from Google, just to sort of provide an example of this. And it says, lichens are any numerous complex plant-like organisms made up of algae or cyanobacterium and a fungus growing up in a symbiotic association with a solid surface. So it just reiterates that while they are plant-like, they are not strictly speaking a plant. The second point I wish to raise with the panel is the definition for improved pasture. So EDS supports a permitted activity for areas of improved pasture only on the grounds that these areas are mapped so that the boundaries are certain. Improved pasture is a highly contested and ambiguous concept. It requires plan users and decision makers to determine whether the species have been deliberately introduced, whether exotic species dominate in composition and cover, and whether naturally occurring Indigenous species are largely absent from the area. The difficulties in assessing what is and is not improved pasture is highlighted in the ecological evidence for the Director General of Conservation, as is the difficulty of using the notified definition for dryland ecosystems, such as those present in the Selwyn High Country and the Canterbury Plains. Without providing clear boundaries of what does and does not come within the rule, it is likely to facilitate further loss of Indigenous vegetation in the district. This would not be appropriate for a permitted activity. Mapping provides certainty and clarity to plan users and decision makers alike, and will enable the proper maintenance and protection of Indigenous biodiversity in the Selwyn district. The third point I wish to raise with you is the identification of significant natural areas. So the full extent of what is significant in terms of Section 6C is not identified in the plan. The Selwyn district is home to many threatened or naturally uncommon ecosystems and species, some of which are endemic to the area. These areas of significant Indigenous vegetation were not protected by the notified policy and rule framework, failing to give effect to Council's obligations under Section 6C of the RMA. EDS strongly supports the suite of changes recommended in the Section 42A report with respect to the identification of significant natural areas. These changes included changes to the definition of SNAs and changes to policies 1, 2, and 4. Collectively, these changes require that all areas meeting the criteria for significance are identified as such, based on their ecological value and regardless of landowner agreement or prior identification and scheduling. The recommended changes are a vast improvement on the notified plan provisions, which in the absence of all SNAs across the district being mapped and listed in Schedule 4, would not have achieved Council's obligations in relation to Indigenous biodiversity. Where EDS does not support these changes, as elaborated further on in written submissions, and I'm happy to answer questions on those provisions if required. Building on this, EDS is also strongly supportive of the proposed changes to the rule framework, which set out which activities can occur as a permitted activity within SNAs and which can only occur as a permitted activity outside of SNAs. Given the minimal Indigenous biodiversity that remains across the district and the likely significance of what is remaining, permitting area-based clearance in SNAs would likely undermine the objectives in the plan and is not consistent with the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement or Section 6C RMA. The fourth point I'd like to talk about is the unwanted organisms exception. So the Section 42A report introduced an exception to the avoid requirement in Policy 4, where vegetation clearance within an SNA is necessary for the clearance of material infected by unwanted organisms. EDS is concerned that, as currently proposed, this could permit wide-scale clearance within significant areas. This may have greater adverse effects on biodiversity values than not providing for it. Infections of Manuka and dryland cress, both of which would meet the criteria for significance, are two examples of this. The exception with Policy 4, coupled with the new permitted activity, will enable uncontrolled clearance of such vegetation, provided it is infected with an unwanted organism, and this is not appropriate for clearance within an SNA. EDS does not support this approach and considers it as contrary to directive higher order provisions requiring maintenance and protection of Indigenous biodiversity. I note that the comments had been made by the reporting team this morning as to the definition of unwanted organisms. I suspect that this goes some way to resolve EDS's concerns, but we would need to be satisfied that those problems that I've just addressed are illustrated are addressed by that change in definition. And I think that might be an ecological question for the likes of Mr. Harding, Mr. Head, and others who are going to be presenting either later today or tomorrow. So finally, I just want to talk briefly about the role of important infrastructure and the policy framework for that within the plan. The definition of important infrastructure in the plan is very broad in scope. In addition to what would be considered regionally and nationally significant infrastructure, it also covers activities that are of a public and community scale. Examples of this are public and community scale infrastructure, irrigation and stock water infrastructure, and community land drainage infrastructure. Provision for these smaller scale infrastructure activities could have a potentially significant adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity and should not be provided for in the policy. If a bespoke policy is to be provided for infrastructure, this should be limited to nationally and regionally significant infrastructure, and a definition for what that includes be included in the plan. This is particularly so given that clearance associated with these activities is a permitted activity under Rule Eco RD 3F. So just in conclusion, the Selwyn district supports a wide range of Indigenous species, habitats and ecosystems. However, these have suffered considerable loss over the recent decades. Council is under an obligation to maintain what remains of Indigenous biodiversity and protect those parts of it which are significant. The changes sought by EDS are in pursuit of those dual objectives of maintenance and protection and seek to further halt any loss of Indigenous biodiversity in the Selwyn district. So on that basis, I'd welcome any questions that the panel may have.
Thank you very much for that. We'll see if we have questions. Malcolm, any questions? No? Have you any questions for EDS?
Kia ora, no thank you.
And Lindsay.
Good morning. Just a couple. Your paragraph 23, where you talk about the ambiguity in terms of small scale, low impact activities provided for in Eco P3. Do you think there is any need or any necessity for some sort of nod to that there are very small scale things which can occur which don't necessarily trigger a rule in the plan? Is there, potentially there could be a perverse situation where something which is really small scale could trigger a rule? Is there some happy medium between the two?
So as I understand it, and sort of, I think what's reiterated in the Section 42A report is that, I guess the definition of small scale and small scale and low impact. Yeah. That's sort of defined with reference to what is a permitted activity in the rules.
Yes.
So I guess my answer is no. I think that the policy itself has ambiguity and it has the potential to permit clearance of things that may not come within those definitions. I think there's also a problem with defining those terms, and that would be one other option. But I think the safest thing to do is to delete the policy and then have those activities provided for as permitted activity rules in the rule framework.
So, sorry, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of your relief. Mm-hmm. It's your preference is to remove the policy.
Yes.
Okay, and then make some sort of recognition within the rule.
Yeah, if need be. If there's other activities that are not captured by the permitted activities already, and as I understand it, the policy is supposed to talk to those permitted activities as they sort of define what is small scale and low impact.
Right. No, I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Just a couple of things from me. Your paragraph 8, you say the exposure draft for the NPS Indigenous biodiversity is therefore of limited weight. Interested in your word limited, I would have put no weight. It has no legal status, does it?
It doesn't have legal status, but it is. It's quite far through the process, and I think that it is something that is. It should be given weight, and limited is a qualifier because it hasn't yet been gazetted, but it is being through a discussion document on the draft, and then there's been an exposure draft, and there have been changes within those drafts, but it's sort of retained the same structure. It has also been through the collaborative process of the Biodiversity Collaborative Group, and there has been a wide range of consensus across main industry groups and stakeholders. So I don't agree that it should have no weight. I understand that because it has not yet been gazetted, it can't be a document that you do place a lot of weight on because it's possibly susceptible to change. But I think the general direction contained within that NPS should be taken into account by the panel and the council.
My understanding is that submissions have only very recently closed on that document.
Yes, yeah, they closed, I think, 1 week ago.
And quite a wide range of submissions seeking a large number of changes.
Yes, I believe so. I haven't reviewed them. I'm aware that we did one, and I'm aware that a lot of other organisations did them. But I just think in terms of the general thrust of the document, it hasn't really changed since. So it's the third time that this thing's tried to be passed, and since the process had begun, there was a 2-year or 18-month process with the Biodiversity Collaborative Group. There was then, I think, a discussion document and a draft. So the BCG, the Biodiversity Collaborative Group, put out draft wording that was then put out for the public for submissions. I think it was 2 years ago, and then there's been the exposure draft more recently. And while there has been some changes and there have been submissions on things, I'm referring to it as the general thrust. The general thrust of the document in terms of seeking better protection for Indigenous biodiversity, things like mapping of SNAs, all of that sort of stuff has remained the same. So if this thing is gazetted, it's very likely that general thrust of the document is going to be there, notwithstanding there might be tweaks to the policies and things through the submission process.
Now, you've asked us to delete Eco P3, but I don't think EDS submitted on that provision.
Yes, we did.
What's the submission point number?
So we, in our initial submission on the notified plan, we had a covering document and a table. And in the table, it is, so if you look at our
I know, I found it. It's your
You found
submission
it?
point 01. Yeah, you're just
Yeah.
called EDSI in the 42A report, not EDS. So
Yes, yeah, I think it's EDS Incorporated.
yeah, okay,
Yeah.
got that. Now, in your verbal presentation, you expressed concern about the provision for, I'll just find it, it's your important infrastructure, your paragraph 29, and you referred verbally to some examples, and I think you said irrigation, drainage, but you were speaking really fast and I didn't capture the other. What else did you mention there?
So when I was speaking verbally, I discussed public and community scale irrigation and stock water infrastructure and community land drainage infrastructure. So those are just two examples that were pulled from the definition of important infrastructure. And they're two examples that have been raised by Mike Harding in his evidence for the Director General of Conservation.
Yeah. Is EDS aware of any actual examples within the Selwyn district where the maintenance of that infrastructure has resulted in inappropriate clearance of Indigenous vegetation?
No, not firsthand. No, I'd have to get someone else to answer that for you, sorry.
Yeah. All right, no, thanks. There are only a couple of things I wanted to clarify with you. So thanks very much for the material you've provided to date and your verbal presentation and answering our questions. Appreciate that.
Great, thank you.
So that's very timely, brings us to morning tea. So we'll now adjourn for, let's take 20 minutes and we'll reconvene at 10 minutes to 11. hearing. Just before we do, just a follow-up matter with the 42A team. So thanks for emailing us the recommended definition for material infected by unwanted organisms. So that would become a definition that would apply plan-wide or just to that one chapter?
It would apply plan-wide, but the actual provisions would sit in this chapter. From memory, I'd need to check if it was going to, if Ms. Lewis was proposing it to apply it in other chapters, but I can do that as part of my right of reply if you like.
Yeah, so if it's to apply plan-wide, wouldn't it just sit within the definitions chapter?
Yes, it would.
Yeah,
that's the intention.
That's the intention, yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Right, at this stage, we're hearing from the Canterbury Botanical Society, which I imagine is you two. Would you like to introduce yourselves to us and then
Kia ora,
present
good
more
morning.
material to us? Thank you.
I'm Paula Godfrey, a senior ecologist.
And I'm Tom Ferguson. I'm a nursery production manager at Waiora, which is a native plant nursery. So today we're representing the Canterbury Botanical Society. The Canterbury Botanical Society, a bit about us. We're a mixture of professional botanists and botanical enthusiasts, so people who just want to learn more about the different types of plants we have in Canterbury. We've been around for almost 70 years. So we were founded in 1953. Should we bring up the PowerPoint? Ideal. So you can see there's an old photo of us on the top left. That's pretty much what we do. I think sort of outfits that we wear have changed slightly since that time, but same sort of thing. We're on our hands and knees looking at rare, interesting plants. There's some photos of a recent trip in the Selwyn district. So today we're opposing to and supporting one part of the Selwyn district plan.
Next slide, please. So we strongly oppose the Indigenous vegetation clearance being a permitted activity, and particularly respect to EIB Rule 1, where the works are permitted within an area of improved pasture. And I know we've covered the term improved pasture before, but so we're just going to go over why we think that. Next slide, please.
So this is out near Cass, and it's that typical beautiful high country landscape. And you'd consider that improved pasture. So the exotic pasture species would be dominant. But I guarantee you that if the Canterbury Botanical Society went out there, we would find so many interesting things in that so-called improved pasture. You can see there's plenty of native species. These turf areas are good because the sheep, cows graze down the exotic grasses, and between those exotic grasses is where we find a lot of Canterbury endemics. So it's a good case of farming coexisting with the natural values that we have. So these pastures, they're home to these shrublands with lizards and interesting invertebrates, so moths and things like that, and birds. And you can see this is the sort of landscape that tourists, both from across the country and from overseas, come to Selwyn to see. This is what makes us beautiful, is this mixed agricultural Indigenous landscape.
Next slide, please. So we also oppose the EIB Policy 7, which encourages the use of biodiversity plans. Generally, biodiversity plans are a really good thing, but when the biodiversity plans is with Schedule 2, where it says that Indigenous vegetation clearances might happen within areas of SNA and previously uncleared areas, and areas that are identified as significant or would be identified as significant. This is really concerning for us because we don't see how this would achieve the overall objectives of enhancement of Indigenous biodiversity values. Next slide, please. So New Zealand is a real hotspot for Indigenous biodiversity, and we actually have about 80,000 endemic species that are only found in New Zealand. And among our plants, already we have 289 that are threatened and 749 that are at risk, meaning that they will be extinct in the next century. And that is about 40% of our total Indigenous plants in New Zealand. So that would be a massive loss.
So can we go back to the previous slide? Yeah, this one here. So we kind of skipped past this one, but so what's the true cost of Indigenous vegetation loss? Protecting remnant vegetation is actually quite economical. So you're talking between $500 to $1,000 a hectare, bit of, pest control, fencing. There's not much that you have to do to protect the real deal. However, a lot of people seem to think planting is the solution, but it's very expensive. So, to actually plant some trees and look after it to get it established and almost looking like remnant vegetation, you're talking $80,000 to $150,000 a hectare. So there's an example there at Prebbleton. There's sort of similar planting projects right across the plains with Te Ara Kakariki. You've got the Maho Reserve. But why are we spending so much money trying to plant native vegetation, but then allowing for the loss of thousands of hectares of remnant vegetation elsewhere? The sort of the restoration plantings are always going to be a superficial sort of, they're not, they don't have the integrity that remnant vegetation has.
Next slide.
2 slides forward, please. Perfect.
Oh, yes. So ecosystems are never quite the same after humans. So generally what we have now is a degraded ecosystem, which is what we see in the high country. And like Tom says, planting is not a replacement for the real deal at all. Next slide, please.
So on the Canterbury Plains, we don't measure sort of remnant vegetation that the Canterbury Botanical Society looks at in terms of hectares. Often it's not even hundreds of square meters. Sometimes it's small little patches, individual plants. These roadside golden taramia, they were some of the last on the Canterbury Plains. And with a bit of careless herbiciding, they were sort of killed off. This used to be a good seed source for Waiora Nursery. We used to collect seeds of golden taramia from there. Herbicide gone. That's that same roadside now. The farmer has herbicided little patches, and that grass there is actually full of native vegetation. That's not exotic grass. There's Bulbinella angustifolia. That's the so yellow flower there, native species. And then what he's done is he's planted flaxes. So he's done a native planting in an area that's had so much loss. And this was one of the roadsides of the Canterbury Botanical Society. We used to love stopping there and having a look at all the different species we could find. Now it's just an example of rural gardening.
Next slide. So the use of the word improved pasture in the Christchurch City Plan led to the clearance of Kaitoriti Spit. And this Kaitoriti Spit vegetation clearance did not breach anything in their plan. And unfortunately, this area in Kaitoriti Spit holds the world's largest population of Muehlenbeckia mastonii, which is a threatened, nationally endangered shrub. And there are less than 1,000 individuals of this in the wild. Also, within that area, we have Carmichelia oppressa and Crispedia thinicola, which only occur in this area. So having that area being allowed under the plan as improved pasture to be cleared is really detrimental for our Indigenous biodiversity.
Next slide, please. So this is Bankside Scientific Reserve in the Selwyn district. And you can see that's it there on the right, that red square. And this is regarded as one of the best dryland Kānuka sort of areas on in the Selwyn district and the sort of plains. And that's it back in 1975, where there was a lot more. So you can see that it's just that gradual loss. There's a picture of it on the bottom left, so you can kind of imagine it's that sort of Kānuka landscape. And there's interesting rare plants there, sadly due to edge effects. So from all that green surrounding it, a lot of species have been gradually lost, but there's so many species that have been recorded there and so much interest around what those species meant for our natural history. One of the species that's still there is this Clematis quadribracteolata. It's a native climber, and when it flowers, it smells like Old Spice. It's got this beautiful, like, yeah, Old Spice smell. If we go to the next slide, this is the Teperita Drylands. It's an area on the north side of the Rakai River. If you've been out to Teperita, and you can go down to the river, a lot of it was Lynn's land, but it's been converted more and more to dairy pasture. So that paddock there, that's now all dairy pasture. But what remaining land there is, the Canterbury Botanical Society has pushed for Lynn's to transfer over to DOC. So that's something that we're really pushing. In these drylands, there's Alleria denocarpa, which is a species only found in Canterbury between the Waimakiri and the Rakai River, nowhere else in the world. There's less than 700 plants remaining, and there's a few at the Teperita Drylands. Raulia monroe, a threatened nationally vulnerable species, one of the sort of turfy small species. And you have things like your copper butterflies, which feed on the Mullumbeckia there. If we go to the next slide.
This is some of the high country tracts of improved pasture which have been, excuse me, this is part of the Cass ecological, oh no, I'm correct. So the picture on the left shows pasture in the high country with the areas of really bright green, which used to be sort of what would be called now improved pasture, which would now be called sort of high producing grassland. And the map on the right shows the Lynn's cover database, the land cover database that actually Manaaki Whenua produces, showing the low producing grassland and depleted grassland. And this is sort of a map showing the areas where these sort of high producing grasslands are likely to occur and probably will occur. And some of the ecosystems we have left on these sort of lower plains are the most intact specimens or types of these ecosystems that we have now. Next slide, please.
So it seems like no flat land in these montane basins that's in private ownership is safe. More and more, we're seeing cultivation creeping up these slopes, like you can see on the top left there, taking out those fans. There's another photo. These are all the three, apart from the helicopters, all in the Selwyn district. So you can see that cultivation of the flat land. Regulation needs to preempt further loss because cultivation will continue further and further up. So this improved pasture, although it may be, is turning into cultivated pasture at an alarming rate.
Next slide, please. So we have some examples of vegetation clearance. So this one here is in the Cass Ecological District, and this photograph was taken between 2004 and 2010. And if we get the next slide, we can see the vegetation change from 2015 to 2016. And you can see that there has been an area of pasture that's been improved into high producing grassland with the loss of Indigenous vegetation. And this would be a permitted activity under the plan. Next slide, please.
This is a similar example in the White Cliffs Ecological District. So this is between 2004 2010, still a bit of shrubland remaining. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that clearance of the shrubland as that improved pasture gets turned into cultivated pasture, and we're losing these habitats. If we go to the next slide. Do you want to talk on this, or should I talk on this?
So this area is part of the map, yeah. The map. Yeah. So this is the Manaaki Whenua have got a land classification, threatened environment classification, and the area that we just seen in White Cliffs Ecological District is within the area with less than 10% remaining. So it is smack bang in that area, what we would call low producing grassland, which is now rapidly becoming a depleted, high producing dairy farm. Next slide, please. So in 2001, Environment Canterbury released a report on Indigenous vegetation loss in the high country. And in it, they analysed satellite imagery from 1990 to 2019. And what they found was large-scale clearance of Indigenous vegetation. And there has been, within the Selwyn District Council in the Waimakiri district, there has been 1,139 hectares cleared in the last 40 years, 30 years, and 3,918 hectares cleared in the Rakaya district.
If you go to the next slide. So you can see in this report, between the period 1990 to 2000, there was actually no vegetation clearance that was visible by satellite. It was, you started sort of seeing clearance between 2001, 2008. Those little dots of green there, the lime green, that was the clearance that was observed. Then the blue is that period between 2009 and 2012. And then all those red areas there is vegetation clearance that occurred between 2013 and 2019. So it's quite worrying that there's this trend for more and more land getting converted from improved pasture to cultivated pasture. If we go to the next slide, here's some of our special things we have in the Selwyn district. So on the top left is Cardamine magnifica. It's threatened nationally critical. So it's well on its way to becoming extinct if sort of things continue the way they're going. This is only found in limestone country in the Selwyn district, nowhere else in the world. This is Carmicalia toilosa on the bottom left. This is more sort of the Selwyn foothills. We find it's found across the Canterbury foothills. But Selwyn district has the largest population left in the world. There's only less than 1,000 of these plants left in the world. You've got the Waitaha gecko, also known as the Canterbury gecko, which is at risk declining. And as we lose habitat, these are the species that are increasingly at risk. There's some pictures of orchids. Orchids, you only see them at certain times of the year, and these sort of improved pasture landscapes, which are becoming cultivated, that's where we find these orchids, these beautiful orchids that need bare ground to grow and do their thing. So there's Pterostylis, is that Tanipota or Tristis?
Tristis, I think.
Tristis, yeah, and Thermometra hatchii. Little wee things that you'd have to get down your hands and knees and see, but look at that, that's stunning.
Another one of our endangered species is the Helichrysum dimorphum, the climbing daisy. There's also less than 1,000 of these in the wild, and also only found in the Selwyn District Selwyn District, in the Waimakariri Basin. And this particular plant often gets cleared alongside Matagari because they visually look quite similar and grow in the same habitat types. And so clearing improved pasture areas would also really dramatically reduce the number of these individuals.
Next slide, please. So here's some examples of that fast-paced sort of clearance in the Selwyn. We can see the writing on the wall. If we continue to have this, council does not regulate, it's going to be too late. We're going to lose all these things that make these landscapes special. As a permitted activity, there's no checks in place. There's nothing that anyone could do as we lose these montane basins, which are found nowhere else in the world, these interesting vegetation ecosystems. So we oppose this Indigenous vegetation clearance being a permitted activity in improved pasture. Yeah, because it's not going to achieve the objective of no net loss of Indigenous vegetation. Also, a lot of the provisions around SNAs, and we go to the layer for SNAs, and there's no listed SNAs. So I see that there's all these provisions for protecting significant natural areas, but most other councils, like the likes of Timaru and that, they have all their SNAs listed, so people can see that where they are, and it provides a lot more clarity for landowners that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the policy that we do support is the banning of some weedy plants, especially rowan. So it is really great because rowan has become a real big weed problem in the high country.
Should we go to the next slide? Sorry. Yeah,
that's some rowan. Yeah, and it's horrifying that it's still available to buy at plant nurseries. So yeah, so we're also really excited about the banning of ash and silver birch and holly in the high country as well.
Yes, that's good work that's in the draft plan. Yeah. Here's some examples of silver birch. This is by Lake Linden, if you know the sort of car park there. where silver birch has gone from plantings by the lake up into that high country. You can see it all seeding there. If we go to the next slide, this is Rowan.
Hawthorn.
Oh, sorry, Hawthorn.
Hawthorn,
It's Hawthorn. But that's Porter's Pass as you're driving up. And it did get sort of eradicated from one site, but it already spread from where they got rid of it to the neighboring blocks of land. And then there was no control in those neighboring blocks of land. And so it's just kept going and going and going up these hillsides.
Yeah, so, but we think that it's also a good idea to not only think about the plants that are already a problem, but start thinking about the plants that are going to be a problem or that already show potential to become a problem. So we have our next
So if we go
slide.
to the next slide, yeah.
So
this is a notable weed, ivy. I'm sure that a lot of you would have seen ivy around the Selwyn district. We went to a nice Potocarp beach remnant in the Selwyn district where ivy was strangling, old potocarps. They were hundreds of years old, bringing them down. The crazy thing is that ivy is still sold in garden centres in the district, and it's still permitted to be planted. We reckon ivy should be listed in that sort of plants that are not to be planted. Yeah, and it'll save the council long term because the site we went to, Selwyn District Council, is spending thousands of dollars clearing that ivy from the bush. Here's another potential weed that isn't on your do not plant list, but we believe it should be because of just how quickly we've seen it take off in beech forest. So that sort of high country beech forest, this Chilean myrtle just thrives. It just takes off and goes like wildfire. And we would like to see that included in the no plant for that high country overlay in particular. But I think that it's good that there's a start in terms of some species, but we believe that there's more species that should be added. Probably if you look at what council's spending on weed control and what species you're spending money on, getting those species put into your list is going to save you long term. Thank you. That's us.
Thank you very much for that. I'll see if we have questions for you. Malcolm, any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So thank you for your very good presentation. Very interested to see that Chilean myrtle. It's something that maybe we can look at as a panel as to what is on the list. I'm very interested in, as we have heard from many submitters this morning, talking about improved pasture turning into converted pasture. What sort of relief do you think what's the relief you'd seek in our plan to alter that situation?
It shouldn't be a permitted activity.
yeah, it needs to have some kind of
Just take
discretionary
permitted activity status away from it.
That's right. So to turn one of these areas into improved pasture to sort of high producing grassland, you really do need an assessment of effects, like Dr. Grove said.
I've just something else. And as with many of the other submitters this morning, you are asking for the mapping of SNAs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks for coming along.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Yvette?
Kia ora and thank you. I just wanted to do a check-in too about the map, and also too, how many species, Indigenous species, are unique to Selwyn area? Do you know that figure?
Not off the top of our heads, but probably
They're threatened.
There's quite a lot,
Yeah.
particularly on the low grasslands, because there's just almost nothing left.
And then there's regional extinctions that happen. So there's a lot of species that once were on the Selwyn Plains, but the number keeps getting less and less and less as we lose plant species. So
like the golden taramea and the bulbinella that we showed in that slide, both extremely rare on the plains now.
Yeah. And then in the high country, we're getting sort of regional extinctions. So even though nationally, some of these species might not be extinct, we're losing them from certain areas. So I think that that's something that needs to be stopped, as regional extinctions within Selwyn, because it's just, we talk to these older botanists because the society's been around for a long time, and they'll drive somewhere and go, there used to be this plant here, there used to be this here, And there's a lot of, driving past an empty paddock where there's nothing left. Yeah.
Yes, it is in some places quite well documented, the loss that we have had from previous botanical trips and by ecologists that have visited many years ago, decades ago, and you go to those same places and there's just nothing left.
And once it's lost forever. It's just.
Yeah, we showed quite a few pictures of critically endangered species. When it gets to the critically endangered list, the next step is extinction. And when we get down to less than 1,000 plants, extinction is not very far away. Sorry.
Just no, that's all right. No, that's fine.
Possibly Nick here tomorrow will be able to give you an exact figure for the number of species. But
no, just thinking in terms of looking at overlay and what have you. Yeah, my mind's just in that space. And also too, it's been heartening to see within some of the submissions and within the section 42, looking at pretty Rita, the dryland, the species within there, the decline. Have you seen, a vast decline? Do you know much about that decline area within those dry plains area?
Well, I've seen plenty of GPS because I work at a native plant nursery, so we have GPS records of where we used to collect our seeds, and more I have old GPS records, and there's nothing there, and the satellite imagery, it's all publicly available. You can see there was native vegetation, indigenous vegetation. Now there isn't, and it makes it harder and harder for, say, a native plant nursery, because the spots where we used to go to collect these native plant seeds are rapidly disappearing. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your very informative presentation. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And Lindsay.
Yes, thank you very much. I certainly agree with Yvette on those final comments. You're obviously concerned about the continual loss or the potential for continual loss of Indigenous biodiversity, and that's understood. Do you think there is potential to bring it back some way to where it was 20 years ago, and what might be the barriers to enhancing or improving the levels of Indigenous biodiversity over and above what we've got right at this point in time?
I think that the main focus would be to retain what we've got before we move on to extending that or improving what we've got.
So we don't want to go to the stage of the right hand of the three biblical pictures then?
No. I mean, eventually, but we've got bigger problems at the moment with our current loss. So preferably we'd like to halt the loss and then move forward.
And then, but that will be some stage in the future once the loss is halted.
Correct.
Okay.
And bringing it back is very expensive. I mean, I don't know who's going to pay for, putting things right again, but it's so much cheaper just to not lose those things in the first place. But we think that in terms of where loss has occurred without a resource consent, once it becomes something that you need a consent for, then it should be that you have to put things back as they were, just like
reinstating.
If you build a house without consent, you got to pull it down again. It's like that sort of, that's what we would expect. Otherwise, people just go, oh, well, it's gone now, so we'll just leave it gone. We'll just leave it as.
I think avoid has to be the main priority before you skip straight to mitigation or remedy.
Do you have any comment on offsets at all?
Offsets should be avoided. Well, in
all cases,
no.
Well, offsets are like a good sort of stick in terms of after the loss has occurred, but the best is not to have to offset, but to retain what we currently have.
So it's a last case scenario, really, after we've gone through the hierarchy of avoid, minimize, mitigate, remedy.
Thank you for that.
At the start of your presentation, you said you're going to, your main concern revolved around two provisions. One was EIB P7. What was the other one?
EIB P, was it R1.
1.4i, was it?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So just in terms of those two provisions, the officers have recommended to us the deletion of EIB P7. So I presume you'd be happy with that?
That's great.
Yeah. So is that a yes? You'd be happy with that?
I think so, but
Yeah.
which is the,
You're
Okay.
encouraging the use of
that's right,
biodiversity
yeah, I
plans.
think so, because it is counter sort of active too.
In terms of this issue of improved pasture, and just from your presentation, just two issues I wanted to explore with you. First of all, in terms of the primary area of concern, and I think a lot of your slides referred to the high country. And within the high country, would the main areas there be what's depositional landforms, particularly colluvial and glacial landforms? So fans at the base of hills, moraine outwash, would that
That's
be the
the-
primary focus of
Those
concern?
montane basins, that's
Yeah.
the trend we see, is anything flat gets turned from improved pasture to cultivated pasture. But increasingly, as sort of landowners run out of that flatland, they're going into steeper and steeper country.
Yeah.
And it depends on the agricultural technology available. So we see that in the future, the trend will be for, you know, those sort of sloped areas to be developed as well, if there is no protection for them.
Yep, okay. So I just want to confirm, so the primary area of concern in terms of geography would be those colluvial and glacial depositional landforms in the high country? Right, okay.
Yeah, those montane basins.
Just because they're the easiest ones to get a tractor on today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand that.
Takes a bit more work, you know, a bit more skill to, you know, cultivate something with a bit of slope.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So the slope is sort of probably the secondary.
Yeah,
There's
it's a bit safer
flash
because
tractors
of
out there that self-level and things, so you can.
That's okay, just wait for the next question now. So yeah, in terms of the activities on those areas, I take it from your presentation, you don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, you don't have an issue, and this is in terms of improved pasture, you don't have an issue with grazing?
No, well, if it's already been grazed, then continued grazing is not going to result in net biodiversity loss.
Yeah.
It's if you know, sort of say you're talking bush where it hasn't been grazed and then grazing is introduced, then there'll be a change. But so Selwyn district is unique in that we're not like the rest of New Zealand. Our indigenous vegetation is mostly found in grazed pastoral landscapes, and the species that have survived and endured till now, they're the ones that actually sort of complement the pastoral landscape.
Yeah.
They will probably continue to survive with the current management.
Yeah.
So it's a changing of management that we're concerned about.
Yeah. I've been a commissioner on Canterbury Regional Council's land and water plan hearings, including the part of that plan that covers this district. And we had evidence there that, in fact, the grazing of some areas, including some tussock lands, can actually be beneficial for the native species. And you highlighted that as well. So I'm just interested in exploring potential solutions. So what if a proposition was to enable, as a permitted activity, the grazing of those areas, but any other form of indigenous vegetation and clearing within those areas by way of cultivation or mechanical means would require a consent? Would that
Yes,
would that be a suitable
that would make a
outcome
massive difference
from your point of view?
Yeah, and also including the irrigation of these areas and fertilization.
Yeah,
which makes it a bit more tricky.
it does.
But when you irrigate an area that's dry land, I mean, huge changes occur.
So in terms of the area that I asked you about earlier, these colluvial and glacial areas, the outwash fans and montane areas, are they irrigated?
They generally get cleared before irrigation.
Yeah. Okay. So irrigation would be a secondary or down the road activity rather than a clearance activity of its own right.
Yes, I'm not a farmer, so I wouldn't know
if
they would try to just irrigate and improve pasture that way without clearance.
Once you spend money on irrigation, the thing is that they wouldn't irrigate unimproved pasture and sort of like rank grass or low producing pasture. Sorry.
Yeah. All right. Now, I'm just interested in hearing your view on some potential solutions to the problems that have been brought to our attention. Of course, we need to look at what scope we have within submissions to recommend any changes to the council, but that's been helpful. What else do I want to say? You, as a number of submitters, have highlighted the issue of mapping. Unfortunately, the plan as notified did not map. We've only had one submission asking for a specific mapped area to be included. That's been recommended to us to do so. Any other mapping would need to occur by way of a variation or a plan change. We simply can't just make stuff up and stick it in the plan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it takes a very long time to map correctly.
Yeah. All right, that's all I wanted to ask you about, but it's been very interesting and helpful, and thank you for taking the time this morning to speak to us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
So our last submitted this morning, Federated Farmers, Dr. Lionel Hume. Dr. Hume, come on up. So Dr. Hume, good morning and welcome. You've appeared before us several times before, but just for the sake of everyone who's listening, thank you very much for your submission and for the evidence that you've pre-circulated for our benefit. You don't need to read any of that out loud to us, but of course you're very welcome to highlight key points, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Yes, I'm not planning to say much right now. I guess one of the sort of main points we want to make is that we can very much see conservation and protection taking place alongside farmers, and highlight the fact that direct involvement of farmers is crucial. Farmers, land managers are the ones that are going to have to deliver on a lot of the good stuff that's hopefully going to come out of the EIB chapter. And also we'd like to highlight the value of non-regulatory approaches like QE2, which has got a proven track record. Other credible non-regulatory processes might exist too, and also regulation. But farmers need to be involved in all of those things. It's far easier to achieve good outcomes with willing people than it is with those that are resisting every step of the way. Also, something we've given a bit of thought to is grazing being coexistent with Indigenous species, and I think the previous speakers said something about that too. Just removing animals, removing grazing from an area that's been grazed in the past, if it's a gravel outwash or something like that, doesn't mean it's going to return to some pristine prehistoric state. There's all sorts of weed invasion and so on that can occur. So yeah, I guess the point is removal of grazing can lead to adverse outcomes. And I came across one example the other day, and I apologise that I haven't really got details of it, but this was a farmer in the Lees Valley who had been asked by the regional council to fence a wetland because there was some moss in there that was quite rare. And these people had been grazing the wetland during the summertime when it was dry and hard, but keeping the cattle out of it when it was soft and vulnerable. They put a fence around it, and of course there was a lot of vegetation growth, and the moss is nowhere to be seen. So that's just an anecdotal thing. I haven't seen it with my own eyes, but I can certainly check out the detail if that would be useful. But that's just one example, I guess, of where an outcome can be the reverse of what was hoped for.
Thank you for that. Are you happy if we take questions?
Yes,
now?
yeah, please do.
Any questions? Yvette, any questions for Dr. Hume?
In light of what you've just heard in terms of grazing, especially in the high country, your comment on number 35, did you hear that? Did you hear the view in terms of grazing, especially within the high country? The plants, the weed, they can get down, but they can leave a lot of Indigenous species there. I don't know where I'm really going with this, but just did you have a view, and if you had heard what had just been said in relation to 35, your comment that you had made there, which is good. Significant presence of Indigenous plant species. To seek consent for their routine grazing activity is neither practical or efficient. And I was just wondering that that's your view in terms of that, and just wondering
Well,
in terms of what we've just heard.
What I had in mind, the picture I had in my mind when I thought that, when I wrote that, was a gravel outwash area. It was in the high country. I was on a tramping trip, and we were walking through an area that was, we just sort of come off the road, crossed a river. We're walking through this area that was obviously grazed, but you certainly wouldn't describe it as improved pasture under the definition, because Indigenous species were not largely absent. There was a whole bunch of things sort of happening at more or less ground level, but the area had quite large areas of Matagari on it, for example, which I clearly remember walking through. So yeah, it certainly wouldn't come under the definition of improved pasture, and because of that there'd be various constraints. And I would suggest that a lot of areas that are grazed wouldn't be defined as improved pasture, because there's a great deal of Indigenous vegetation still there. You certainly couldn't describe Indigenous vegetation as being largely absent, thankfully.
Yeah, thank you.
And Lindsay?
Good morning. You've been here for much of the morning, and there has been quite a lot of emphasis on this improved pasture. And the chair put to the previous submitters the option of, or an option to, as an idea about high country pastoral grazing being permitted, and then more extensive Indigenous removal going through a consent process. Do you have a view on that last exchange that there was?
Yeah, okay, so what would require a consent? Scenario you're
well,
describing?
just in terms of otherwise, and removal of Indigenous biodiversity within, subject to the rules.
One of the things that I recall that you're able to do within an area of improved pasture is to remove Indigenous vegetation. So if you had an area that was raised,
yep,
and was defined as Indigenous, defined as improved pasture, sorry, then you could remove Indigenous vegetation from within that.
Mm.
As soon as you get into an area that's not defined as improved pasture, then there are problems with doing a whole bunch of things that may have been done for decades beforehand. So I guess we wouldn't want to get into the situation where an area that's now usefully grazed and Indigenous species coexisting with that, suddenly the farmer wasn't able to do anything with it and just reverted back to something that was no longer any use to him or her. And, you know, that some may see that as a good thing, but it's not necessarily going to be a good thing. Well, not for the farmer, but and not necessarily for Indigenous vegetation either. Because sure, there'll be a change in the ecology, but whether it's a desirable one or not, given the amount of numbers of invasive exotic species we've got floating around. And quite literally floating if it's beside a river.
So if there is the definition of improved pasture could be resolved, would that allay some of the concerns that you've raised? to provide the flexibility. You represent the farming community, which is
Yes,
obviously
yeah,
very
indeed.
large, and obviously the vast majority of the land in Selwyn district is farming land, or a very good chunk of it anyway. So to provide the certainty for the farming operations while also recognising the Indigenous biodiversity values, if you can sort out a workable definition of improved pasture, would that be the place we want to be in terms of decisions?
Yes, I think so. And also the definition of Indigenous vegetation clearance is potentially problematic. Those two together possibly need to be considered together.
Yes. Well, I think
we had concerns with each of those.
So certainly the ecologists who have presented evidence, and some of them are tomorrow as well, have tended to keep the two together.
Yeah.
All right.
That makes sense.
Okay. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hume. No further questions from me. Thank you very much for coming in this morning. And that brings us to the end of submitters for today. But just before we do adjourn, just to the 42A team, I'd like you please to, in reply, explore an option and provide us with wording that would address this issue in terms of, for improved pasture, enabling Indigenous vegetation clearance by way of grazing, but then requiring other forms of clearance, including cultivation, to be a restricted discretionary activity. And I noticed that Eco RC 0.5 is already in restricted discretionary activity, so that framework is already within the plan. So it'd be a matter of coming up with some revised wording, perhaps for Eco RC 0.3I. And also give some thought to whether or not, if that is within scope of submissions, I think it probably is, to maybe targeting that to the high country depositional landforms that we've had brought to our attention this morning. Those landforms obviously comprise alluvial, colluvial and glacial areas. And in terms of alluvial areas, I think the focus might want to be on the fans, because if we included in that river terraces, that would be quite a huge area. I mean, the whole Canterbury Plains is arguably an alluvial terrace, so that might be problematic. So, you know, just in reply, come back with some wording that would give effect to that. Also indicate whether or not you think that's appropriate from your point of view, but I'd certainly appreciate some wording to be put in front of us that we can then consider as an option. All right, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for your presentations. And we now adjourn until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.